The Surrey countryside, a tapestry of rolling hills, lush meadows and quaint villages, seemed untouched by the harsh realities of the world. Beneath its idyllic facade, however, a darkness lurked. A man, his face etched with a sinister calm, moved through the woods. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the landscape. He harboured a monstrous thought in the depths of his mind, a thought that would lead to an action that would ruin the life of an innocent girl. Our story begins on the tranquil Oxshott Heath in North Surrey. It was a bank holiday weekend on Sunday, May the 24th, 1953. 14-year-old Kathleen Ringham was out for a walk when she was brutally attacked from behind. But before she was hit, she managed to get a quick look at the man. She remembered one important feature. He had a cleft chin. The attacker had hit her over the head with the blunt side edge of an axe. She was knocked unconscious. He proceeds to brutally violate her before leaving her slumped on the grass. Kathleen survived but was left with emotional scars that would never fully heal. The police had little to go on, so the case was put on hold. From Oxshott to Teddington, where the fields gave way to suburban streets, it was approximately 10 miles, and the quiet tranquillity of the countryside was replaced by the bustle of urban life. 1953 was the era of big bands and bobby socks, and the country was filled with excitement for the upcoming coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. Buntings were being hung, and Union Jack flags were handed out to be waved with vigour as the new Queen was crowned. 16-year-old Barbara Songhurst, the middle child of 10, was born on April the 16th, 1937. She lived with her parents, Gertrude and Daniel Songhurst. The family were cramped together in a small 3-bedroom house at 75 Princes Road in Hampton Hill, Teddington. Life was tough. Daniel Songhurst had broken his back and was now an invalid. He hadn't been able to work for the past 10 years. With Daniel unable to earn an income, Gertrude had to support the family on a limited amount of benefits, along with whatever the older kids could contribute. Despite the challenges, the family had a strong bond and a lively spirit. Gertrude and Daniel were somewhat relaxed in their parenting, often letting Barbara stay out a bit late. They trusted her judgment. She was sensible, a good girl, and they felt they had raised her well. Having left school, Barbara had managed to get a job at a local chemist shop as an assistant and earned around £1.15 a week, of which half went to her mother. She was an attractive and lively young woman who enjoyed being around other young people her age, deeply faithful to her religion. She was committed to saving herself for marriage. Like most teens, she loved fashion, music and dancing. However, she had a maturity that set her apart from many others her age. Her family had faced tough times, and as a result, she had learned to grow up quickly. Sensible and trustworthy, her family felt confident about her choices and really worried about her making foolish decisions. Barbara's best friend was Christine Rose Reed, born the 18th of March 1935, to Herbert, a grocer's assistant, and Lucy Reed. She was the middle child of 3. Mr. Reed's wage wasn't large, but they lived a modest lifestyle at 15 Roy Grove, Hampton Hill. She came from a more structured household, and just like Barbara's house, it was a loving, caring home. At 18, Christine enjoyed the freedom to stay out late. After facing challenges at school, she landed a factory job in Hampton, earning £3.18 a week. Like many young people at the time, she gave half her pay to her mother to help support the family. Christine wasn't as outgoing as Barbara. She felt a bit shy around new people, but she soon warmed up around them once she got to know them. She was a good-looking girl. They both were. Barbara was a great friend for her. They balanced each other out well. Bubbly Barbara brought out Christine's fun side, and they always looked out for one another. Many would say they were inseparable. The two girls often spent nights at each other's houses. They laughed, played, danced, and cried together. But whatever they did, they always informed their parents about their plans and who they were with, and their parents trusted them completely. They were good, honest girls, and their parents had little to worry about. One of the girls' favourite pastimes was cycling. They cycled everywhere and would often join other young people at dances. Like any other teenagers, they enjoyed the company of others their age and met often with them, just enjoying their youth. On the 29th of May at a popular cafe in Hampton Hill, where the local young men and women would gather to enjoy a soft drink, play on the pinball, or just listen to music and chat, 21-year-old John Wells, one of Christine's neighbours and a good friend, invited Christine and Barbara to a camp meet-up and a bit of a picnic on the following Sunday at Petersham Meadows. It was just a few friends meeting up for some harmless fun. Joining him were his friends Albert Sparks and Peter Warren. Both girls told their parents, and as the parents knew the young lad and the area they were going to, they agreed to let them go. On Saturday the 30th, the two girls had spent the day cycling with their friend Joy Wolveridge. Then in the evening they went on to York House in Twickenham, where they enjoyed a jazz dance. They had had a good day and night, but it was late, so all three left as the dance was ending. Joy, Christine and Barbara left around midnight and cycled home along the dark towpath. They were never worried about the darkness or the quietness of the towpath. They had been cycling this path for years without any problems, and it was safer than the dark, busy roads. They arrived at Christine's house around 12:45 a.m. It was around this time that Joy left them and went home. On Sunday, May the 31st, 1953, just after breakfast, Barbara went cycling back home, where she changed her clothes to a tartan shirt and jeans. She told her parents about the camp meet-up and promised she'd be home around 11 p.m. because she had work the next day. She then returned to Christine's, where she had also changed into a yellow cardigan and dark blue trousers. It was the perfect day, a fine sunny morning. The two girls cycled the path carefree, excited to be out and meeting up with their friends. At around 1:30 p.m, they popped into Barbara's home. It's thought her bike light wasn't working, so they might have been looking for a battery or a bulb for it. It wasn't clear why, and they promptly went out again. Around 2 p.m, the girls arrived back at Christine's for some lunch. They left again at around 4 p.m. and returned again about 5 p.m. that evening for some tea, before leaving again in the evening. This wasn't unusual for the girls. They often flitted from place to place, back and forth to each other's homes. It was a beautiful evening, and Mr. Reed watched as the two girls pedalled away from Roy Grove at 7:30 p.m. to make their way to Petersham Meadows for the meet-up with the others at the camp. The girls knew this route well. They had ridden their bikes down this path numerous times. As they got closer to the camp, the scent of the fire and the food cooking filled the air. They could hear laughter and the sound of a radio playing across the field. There was nothing unusual about this night. This little group of young people enjoying the freedom of their youth with some laughing and maybe a little bit of hijinks. Nothing untoward, just innocent fun. In 1953, the towpath along Teddington Lock and Eel Pie Island was a quieter, more rural setting. It was a narrow dirt track primarily used by horse-drawn barges and pedestrians. The nearby landscape was filled with fields and orchards. The overall vibe was peaceful and calm, making it a favourite spot for those looking to get away from the busy life of London. These spots were popular for camping, just to get away for a short time. It was now late and pitch dark. The only light came from the flames from the now dying campfire. The group judged the time by the chiming of the distant church clock, and the girls departed from the camp at about 11:15 p.m. The girls' bike lights apparently had run flat, so one of the guys lent them his, but it wasn't the best of lights. The young men and a few other campers saw the girls biking down the dark path toward Teddington Lock, where they would cross an iron bridge on their way home. Peter recalled seeing the faint glimmer of his bike light disappear into the dark. The girls were seen one last time. Two friends sitting by the towpath heard them chatting and the recognisable sound of bike wheels spinning. They turned to notice a faint yellow glow from a bike light moving toward Teddington Lock. As night turned into day, both girls were missing. However, no one noticed. Each family assumed the girls were just having a sleepover at the other's house, which wasn't unusual for them. At about 8:15 on the morning of Monday, June the 1st, 52-year-old George Coster, who was a foreman with the Port of London Authority, was cycling down the towpath to check on some work being done on the river embankment. When he arrived at his destination, he looked over at the Twickenham side of the river. He then saw something in the water, a bundle of what looked like clothing floating in the river. Looking closer, to his horror, he saw it was the body of a woman. He jumped on his bike and cycled to the lockkeeper's house to call 999. The Thames Division Police launch arrived quickly. Sergeant George Cooper successfully pulled the body into the boat, and looking closely at the body, he noticed a large gash on the side of her face and a lot of bruising. He immediately ruled out the possibility that she had taken her own life and made his way to St. Helens Pier. The charismatic detective superintendent Herbert Wheeler Walter Hannam, or Bert of Scotland Yard, was put in charge of the case. After the doctor had certified death, the young woman was moved to Richmond Mortuary, where pathologist Dr. Arthur Mant performed an autopsy at 12:10 p.m. in the presence of Detective Hannam. The clothing was carefully looked at as it clung to her lifeless body. The injuries to the young girl were horrendous. She had a large wound in her left cheek, so deep that the cheekbone had been fractured. Dr. Mance found 3 stab wounds in her back, all of which had been delivered with such force they not only punctured the lungs, they punctured her heart. There was a 1-inch gash on the top of her head, where a crushing blow from a heavy object had crushed through her skull, fracturing it. It was blatantly obvious to the doctor that Barbara had been brutally violated. The scratches and bruising on her legs, he surmised, were from being dragged over the gravel by the attacker before throwing her into the water. Dr. Mann was also able to determine the weapons used to inflict the injuries to Barbara were a distinctive knife with a double-edged 1-inch wide blade and a small axe, and that the perpetrator had likely been a man of unusual strength. Hannam believed the motive at first hadn't been murder, because whoever had attacked her had first rendered her unconscious with the blunt side of a sharp object, but with the horrendous injuries coming after rendering her unconscious, something caused him to commit murder. This man may have attacked before, and it's possible he was local to the area. But the city was bustling with thousands of people from around the globe for the new Queen's coronation. He realised that this investigation would be far from simple. Hannam moved ahead with his investigation. It was determined that, as the young woman had been in the water for about 8 hours, it meant the tide had probably carried the girl downstream. So DCI Hannam, looking at a map and river charts of the local area, looked for a point roughly half a mile from where she was found. The site of the attack was found 400 metres from the lock on the Surrey side. Here the main towpath runs next to the River Thames, while a smaller towpath lies a few metres inland. Further inland there is a thicket of shrubs, trees and bushes. On the smaller towpath 2 areas of blood were discovered, along with some clothing and scuff marks in the dirt. And as the search continued, more blood was found on the gravel and on some grass with some items of clothing and 2 pairs of women's shoes. One pair of shoes 2 sizes bigger than the other. So whose shoes were the second pair? And just as important, where were they? It would be a few days later before they had those answers. Also on Monday, June the 1st, when Barbara still hadn't returned home before work, her parents began to worry. They wondered if she had gone directly to work from her friend Christine's place. When they found out from her job that she hadn't shown up, they knew something was seriously wrong. So they called the police. They told the officers that their daughter hadn't come home the night before and they had assumed that she was with Christine Reed. After visiting Christine's home, it became clear to both the police and the families that both girls were now missing. The police had the body of a young woman that fit the description of Barbara. Could this poor girl be their missing daughter? They had to ask the parents to accompany them to identify the body. Barbara's devastated parents formally identified their daughter on the afternoon of her discovery. Christine's family anxiously waited, hoping for any news about their daughter. It felt like a complete nightmare for them. While the rest of the country was celebrating, the Reed and Songhurst families were united in their sorrow. Tuesday, the 2nd of June 1953, was the day of the Queen's coronation. The morning began with cloudy skies that reflected the mood of those involved in this investigation. Hannam was deep in thought. Here he had 2 young women who seemed to be of good character and hadn't been in any trouble and were liked by all who knew them. So what had happened? Why and how would an attacker manage to take on 2 young, fit girls without one of them managed to escape or call for help? And why such a brutal attack? All he knew at that moment was that he had a mystery on his hands. But for now, he needed to find Christine. A decision was made to dredge a 3-mile section of the River Thames between Teddington Lock and Richmond, close to where they had discovered the first body. They had discovered from the parents of the 2 girls that they had both been on bicycles. The police hadn't come across any on the towpath, so they believed they could also be in the river. Eventually an electromagnetic device was brought in, and it soon connected to an object that lifted something out of the water that turned out to be a bike that was later identified as Christine's. But there was no sign of Barbara's bike. Hannam had the tides and flows of the river around where Barbara Songhurst had been found studied. Their efforts led them to a point near Glover's Island, where they hoped to find the other body of Christine. And on June the 6th, at 1:35 p.m, Inspector William Lampard, while on board a police launch, noticed a partially submerged body close to Glover's Island, less than 1 mile from Richmond Bridge. Christine Reed had been found. Once taken from the water, she was quickly looked over before being moved to Richmond Mortuary, where Dr. Mance carried out the post-mortem. An examination of Christine's body showed she had been stabbed 8 times, with some of the wounds puncturing her lungs. The stab wounds were extremely deep, measuring 6.5 inches. Some had forcibly penetrated her chest and heart. Additionally, Christine suffered severe head wounds, similar to those found on Barbara. Her skull had been crushed, fractured in 2 places. She too had been brutally violated, with horrifying wounds to her lower areas. Her injuries were brutal and frenzied. Dr. Mance put the time of death as 5 or 6 days earlier. The pathologist also made it clear to D.S. Hannam that whoever this killer was very strong, going by the depth of the knife wounds. Hannam now had 2 dead young women, and the investigation into their movements on the last night they were seen began. After talking to the families, Hannam had confirmed the girls were responsible, sensible, virtuous, church-going girls, with no enemies, and both had been virgins before being violated, which was also confirmed by the doctor. They talked to the boys at the camp about the evening with the 2 girls. The boys shared what they knew. They had seen the girls leave around 11:15 p.m. and watched them ride down the towpath. About 15 minutes later, the young men settled in for the night. This was all corroborated by the other campers left in the field that night. The 2 friends who had heard the girls chatting while riding their bikes around midnight gave their statement, stating that it was so dark they could barely see, but they hadn't seen or heard anyone else. More information would come forward once the case hit the news. There was one thing that really puzzled Hannam. How did one person manage to overpower 2 girls at the same time without one being able to run away? He had been told by the pathologist that this person must be very strong, but to be able to stop the 2 young fit girls, he seriously thought it might have been 2 people before he came to the conclusion, with the help of a reporter, that it was possible that one man could have managed to slow one or both of them down by possibly throwing something at them. It was then put to Hannam that perhaps the killer had thrown the knife at one of the victims. The idea would go some way to explain some of the wounds. The police accepted this theory and started searching for men who were skilled or known to be reasonably skilled in knife throwing. The police went on to take 1,650 statements from adult resident males in the Teddington area. With the coronation festivities, the net of suspicion was extended to men who had also stayed at local hotels and guest houses. They also questioned men who frequented local pubs, cinemas and restaurants in the Richmond-upon-Thames area. This painstaking level of questioning of hundreds of men came up with nothing. Then, sometime towards the middle of June 1953, a woman was out walking her dog in Windsor Great Park. A man stopped her to ask directions, and as she pointed to direct him, he dragged her into the bushes, where he held a knife to her throat. She struggled fiercely to the point he gave up and fled on a bicycle. The police investigated, and the description of the man would eventually lead them to revisit the attack on 14-year-old Kathleen Ringham on May the 24th at Oxshott, where she was attacked and violated by that unknown man. Some witnesses from that day had reported seeing a man near the scene, a young man with dark hair wearing brown leather gloves and blue overalls. He had a cleft chin. Another witness had also seen this man matching the description close to Oxshott Heath shortly after the attack had occurred. This witness also added the man had a cleft chin. A facial composite of this individual was created and extensively distributed throughout the media. On June the 17th, two former co-workers of a man called Alfred Whiteway were on their way home from work when they noticed Whiteway sitting on a tree stump. They remembered the description of the man wanted in connection with an attack and thought Whiteway seemed to fit that description. They knew he had a cleft chin, so they called the police. The police responded to the workers and drove around searching for Whiteway until they found him. They stopped and questioned him. He was asked to accompany them to the police station. On the journey there, he sat in the back of the police car until they arrived at the station. He was questioned regarding the attack in Windsor Park, which came to nothing, and he was released. The composite picture continued to be shown in the newspapers. Reporters and obviously detectives also continued asking locals if they knew anyone matching the description of the man wanted in connection with the Towpath murders. Several people mentioned the same name more than once, saying, "Alfie Whiteway, he's a wrong 'un." On June the 28th, nearly a month after the vicious murders of Barbara Songhurst and Christine Reed, a passing motorist stopped for a male hitchhiker. The driver became aware of the man's look, and he was reminded about the photo fit in the papers, about a man wanted in connection with the ox shot and the Windsor Park attack. The driver went to the Surrey police with his concerns. The hitcher was picked up and identified by witnesses during an ID parade. He was charged with the attack in Oxshott. When he was placed in another identity parade, the woman recognised him as the man who had assaulted her in Windsor Great Park. The identified man was Alfred Whiteway, who had been questioned and released in Weybridge weeks earlier. Whiteway was remanded in custody in relation to both attacks on the 1st of July. DCI Hannam looked closely into Whiteway's details. Once he had learned that Whiteway was a bodybuilder, knew the area where the girls were killed very well, was an expert knife thrower and lived close to the girls, he ordered Whiteway be questioned regarding the Towpath murders. A few days later, Hannam saw Whiteway while Whiteway was on remand. When asked about Barbara and Christine, he denied knowing anything about the murders. Hannam went on to interview him again on the 3rd, the 8th and the 15th of July, and each time Whiteway denied any involvement. But Hannam was convinced he had his man. In one interview, Hannam asked Whiteway where the axe was that he threw at trees. Whiteway replied that he kept it in a cupboard at home. But despite a thorough search, the police found nothing. Incredibly, when Detective Hannam asked about it again, Whiteway admitted that Kingston police had it after he had pushed it under the seat of the police car when he was picked up at Weybridge. Incredibly, when Whiteway was taken in on the 17th of June, he had managed to take the axe out of his overalls, unnoticed, and pushed it behind the back seats of the police car. It went unnoticed for a while until the police officer who drove the car saw the axe. He didn't know where it had come from, so instead of turning it in, he put it in his locker. Later, the officer went off sick and took the axe home with him. When he realised its importance, he told them he had kept it at home and had been using it to chop wood before bringing in the now blunted axe. An unhappy Hannam had the axe sent off for the long process of forensic testing. Whiteway's clothes had also been sent for forensic testing, which was a slower process than we're used to now. However, dealing with blood analysis was routine, and blood played a crucial role in this investigation. Hannam realised he needed more. Even though Whiteway had admitted to attacking the other women, there were no witnesses to the murders on the Towpath and almost no evidence. The axe was almost worthless. What Hannam needed was a confession. A few days later, Hannam saw Whiteway again at HM Prison Brixton, and again he denied the attacks on the girls, claiming he had spent the afternoon in the company of his wife, Nellie May, and baby daughter Christina, from approximately 7:30 p.m. to between 11 and 11:30 p.m. On the date in question, he, his wife and child had visited Canbury Gardens before returning to her parents' Kingston-upon-Thames home, where he drank a cup of tea on the doorstep before cycling home to his parents' Teddington home via Kingston Bridge, arriving home shortly before midnight. his soon-to-be ex-wife backed his story. Hannam decided to take the axe with him on his next interview. Even though forensic evidence was now not possible, its appearance seemed to shock and disappoint Whiteway. When Detective Hannam placed the axe on the table in front of Whiteway, he immediately recognised it and complained it had been bashed about and was now blunted. Hannam asked Whiteway about his crepe shoes, the ones he'd already told the police he'd worn on the night of the 31st of May, and that's important. He asked him if there would be any reason why there would be blood on these shoes. Whiteway replied no. Hannam went on to inform him that forensics had found that one of his shoes had been exposed to a large amount of blood on it. Even though an attempt had been made to wash it off, there were still traces on the shoe. The traces of blood were crucial to the case. Whiteway denied it, calling the scientists liars. On the 20th of August, Alfred Whiteway cracked, shouting, "You know bloody well I done it, what a bloody mess," telling the police he couldn't control himself around women. He claimed to have initially seen only one cyclist, whom he bashed about the head, and she went down like a log. He then heard another female scream, which shocked him, as he didn't know she was there, before approaching her and shutting her up with his weapons. Whiteway pointed out that Barbara Songhurst, the second girl he attacked, knew him and could have recognised him. He insisted that his attack wouldn't have been deadly if it weren't for this knowledge. He apparently grabbed the paper in front of him and shouted, "I can't stop it, give us it here, I'll sign it." He was formally charged with both murders on the 18th of September 1953. As Whiteway's blood type was determined to be the same as Christine Reed, there was more physical evidence to connect him with the murder of Barbara Songhurst, so the Crown subsequently opted for him to be tried solely for her murder. On the 26th of October 1953, Whiteway was brought to trial at the Old Bailey for the murder of Barbara Songhurst. He was tried before Mr. Justice Hilbery. The prosecution consisted of Christmas Humphreys and J.F. Claxton. The defence consisted of Solicitor Arthur Prothero, who instructed Peter Rawlinson and Michael Havers. Whiteway pleaded not guilty to the charge. When the case went to trial at the Old Bailey, it became apparent that the defence tried to undermine the prosecution by questioning police procedures during the interrogation, particularly over the documenting of interviews where Whiteway claimed he didn't know what he was signing. The main evidence against Whiteway was this alleged signed confession, which was introduced into evidence in the opening days of the trial and which Hannam testified unlocked the whole crime. The exchange in court between the highly regarded murder squad detective Bert Hannam and the barrister Peter Rawlinson became tense. Hannam testified as to both the circumstances surrounding the obtaining of the confession and the actual contents, also alleging that Whiteway had said to him he would later claim his confession was all lies. Rawlinson put Hannam through a tough 2-day cross-examination on the methods he had adopted in drawing up the signed confession. Rawlinson went on to suggest to the jury that Detective Hannam had fictionalised and manipulated the confession. Whiteway himself gave evidence in his defence to both prosecution and defence counsel. He denied having ever confessed to the murders and insisted he had only applied his signature to one caution. He further denied Hannam's allegation that he had been shocked and trembling when informed of investigators having discovered traces of blood on one of his shoes, and emphasised he did not know the actual content of the sole document he had signed, only that Hannam had told him to sign a page with writing on it. The physical evidence included the axe used in the murders, with Dr. Keith Mance testifying the laceration wound to Songhurst's cheek was consistent with having been inflicted by an axe, the size of the one presented into evidence. Mance testified the dimensions of the flat edge of the weapon also perfectly matched the fractures inflicted to her skull, before stating one of the stab wounds inflicted to Songhurst's back would have been almost immediately fatal. The tension was heavy, and angry exchanges between the prosecution and defence were beyond heated. In his closing argument to the jury, Christmas Humphreys referenced the confessions given by Whiteway upon learning of the police's mounting evidence against him. He also described the defence's contention that the police had obtained these confessions via deceit or forgery as the most tremendous attack of this nature ever made within a British court. In reference to the actual motive for Songhurst's murder, Humphreys alleged Whiteway had chosen to murder his victim to prevent her from identifying him as her assailant, stating, "He is violating these girls. His face is inches from theirs. Songhurst might know his face. He has to kill her. Otherwise, she is going to say it was Alfred Whiteway who took my innocence from me last night." In the defence's closing argument, Rawlinson alleged the actual perpetrator had been a lone male on foot who had been seen by several witnesses loitering in the vicinity of the murders before their commission. He also emphasised that Songhurst's bicycle had never been found, and that, as corroborated by family members, Whiteway had been riding his own bicycle on the afternoon and evening of the murders, and as such the actual perpetrator must have fled the scene on Songhurst's bicycle. He then discussed the circumstances surrounding the acts that was presented in evidence against his client, which had been, in his words, conveniently and dubiously discovered at a time police desperately sought one or both of the murder weapons, and his client's alleged confession, which Rawlinson again alleged had been fabricated by police and signed by his client through trickery or force. Rawlinson concluded his closing argument by urging the jury to find his client not guilty. On the 2nd of November 1953, the jury dismissed the allegations made towards the police, and in less than 50 minutes, 22-year-old Arthur Charles Whiteway was found guilty of double violent violations and the murder of 16-year-old Barbara Songhurst. Judge Hilbery ordered that charges against Whiteway for the murder of Christine Reed and the two separate charges of violent eschewal attacks with attempt to violate and robbery, for which he had initially been arrested, lie on file. Sentenced to death, he was hanged by Albert Pierpoint at Wandsworth Prison on December the 22nd, 1953. A short side note. Arthur Charles Whiteway. Born in London on the 21st of June 1931, Whiteway didn't have the best start in life. Born into poverty, his mother struggled to earn a living in domestic service to feed her large family of 9, and his sick father would die of cancer when Whiteway was 14. It would be no surprise that he would end up getting into trouble as a teenager and ended up in a reform school near Swindon. His poor behaviour would continue while at school. He was very poorly educated because he just wasn't interested in learning. Later in life he spent some time in prison for theft and then found work on a construction site where he became known for his upper body strength. People would recall his short temper and how he seemed obsessed with knives, always carrying one around with him, and was often seen throwing them at trees. Nellie became another obsession, and he began following her in the street and chatting to her. They eventually became a couple, but Nellie's mother wasn't having any of it. She did not like Whiteway at all, and he wasn't allowed in her house. The couple would meet in the alley at the side of the house. To make sure her parents couldn't split them up, Nellie got pregnant, so the couple would have to get married. But even then, Nellie's mother would not let him in the house, so Whiteway had to stay at his mother's house on Sydney Street, while his wife lived at her parents'. In May 1953, Alfred Whiteway had a very young daughter and another child on the way. The child was born while Whiteway was in prison. Thank you for watching, or maybe just listening.